Hey guys, welcome back. So now, in a recent squad hour, Caden had asked if we could talk about What If Spider-Man Spider's Shadow. So not only did I put it in the queue, but I pushed it to the top, man. Like, we have to talk about this because this miniseries is so good. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so this story, much like Symbiote Spider-Man, which we covered not too long ago, this is another take that stems from Peter getting his black suit in the first Secret Wars, but this time around, in What If, we're not only going down the route if like Peter kept the suit, but in this case through the writing of Chip Zdarsky, we are exploring this with a much darker twist. But also in this series, we'll be going back to around your time with like Amazing Spider-Man issue 252, when he had just returned from the first Secret Wars with a black suit, and Aunt May stopped speaking to him because he had dropped out of school, MJ called off their engagement, and he's been seeing way more Felicia since he's got back, not to mention he has his hands full with other villains like Hobgoblin, Richard Fisk, and more. But also keep in mind that around this time, Peter was lacking sleep like crazy, and as an early part of his symbiosis, he would also experience a number of nightmares. And when we jump into What If Spider's Shadow, we start off in the middle of one of those nightmares, with him wearing the suit for a short time after returning to Earth, and him noticing that the suit physically makes him stronger, but on top of that, it's affecting his mind. And it's here in his dream where we start to see the bonding process, which comes off as a nightmare, to where he sees Felicia, he sees MJ, he sees Aunt May, and they're telling him like if he had done more, like if he had done his best, or if he was truly giving his all, then why do the people that he loved always die? Which then shows him Gwen Stacy waking him up out of his dream. And like with the red text in his nightmares, like it has me thinking some things, but I'm not even gonna say it. I'll let you guys make your guesses in the comments, and until I'm shown differently, like I'm just gonna stick to where this is going. But with Peter having these nightmares, like he thinks it's just stress. Because for him, around this time, like we've seen before, him and Aunt May, they've had their falling out, plus Peter has his things going on with both MJ and Felicia, so he just figures he'll put on the suit, go for a swing, and just clear his head. And while he's out thinking things over, he also notices that like when he's in the suit, that's the only time he feels better. And just as a reminder, like at this point in time, Peter truly believes that this suit is just some high-tech alien technology that he's been using this whole time. And like at night, he takes it off, much like we had seen in the original run. But because of that, when he has his nightmares, he's not aware that they're just echoes from the suit. But also with him swinging around and clearing his head, he thinks for a minute like, well, this black suit, it does strike fear into the hearts of villains, and it has unlimited webbing, but even still he misses the old red and blue. And right away when he thinks of it, the suit starts changing back to the red and blue color, and it's here where he realizes that the suit can change its appearance. And with seeing this, he does go back to the black, but then he's like, I'll just keep it in mind in case I want to go back to the neighborhood friendly look. But just after this, he then hears an old lady get mugged by a couple guys in the alley, and he jumps in to help. But when this happens, there's a bit of a switch up, because initially though he comes in kind of joking around, his mood then quickly starts to switch from taking these guys down and joking about it to then being like, hey, I'm tired of taking guys like you down over and over again, to where he then applies a bit more pressure than he would have otherwise. And this is something we've seen before as far as like the classic Peter when he first got the symbiote after he came back, and there was this war in his mind between being dark and being good, both in his dreams and in his mind constantly, which is what we're seeing here, but just more detailed and turned up a few notches. But after helping this older lady, he just sends over a couple officers who like a block down so they can clean everything up and just take the crooks in. But after this, he figures like, okay, he's gonna try and get some actual sleep. So he goes back home and he tries to, but then the nightmares come back again. And when they do, he hears a voice asking him if he's the spider and then it just gets cut off because MJ wakes him up, and without knowing, Peter just knocks her across the room. And I'm gonna tell you right now, when I first read this, I was like, this could have been a lot worse right here. Because Peter waking up violently could have been like just an instant kill, but fortunately it wasn't. MJ's okay. But at this time, MJ came over to talk to Peter because not long before, she had called everything off with Peter after Peter had gave her a ring, and she gave the ring back, initially saying that she's too free of a spirit to be tied down, and telling Peter that they can just be friends. But this is something that later had turned into MJ telling Peter that his double life as Peter Parker and Spider-Man, they were too much for her, and that was the real reason she said no. But hey, things happen. He later met Felicia, went to Secret Wars, came back, and now she want to talk again. And she doesn't know the details just yet, like we haven't gotten there. But with coming here, she's just making sure that Peter is okay, because he's been losing a lot of sleep and acting much darker, and that's why she came by to see like what's going on. And at one point she asks about the new suit because she picks it up and it just feels weird, and all Peter tells her is like it's not from here, which is the truth at this point because that's all he really knows. But he doesn't stick around to talk to MJ. He just lets her know like, yeah, something is wrong, but I'll figure it out. And when he goes out, he remembers that he was gonna let Reed Richards take a look at his suit, so he then figures that now is a better time as any. But when he starts to make his way to go see him, all of a sudden the suit is not shooting webs, and likely because the suit doesn't want to go. But with this happening, Peter just figures it's all the more reason to take it to Reed Richards, so if it needs something, he'll figure it out. But before he can go to see Reed, Peter sees an explosion in the distance, and when he goes to swing towards it to check it out, all of a sudden the suit's shooting webs again. So he's like, okay, the whole thing with Reed can wait. But when he gets there, it's the Hobgoblin, who originally was one of the first villains that Peter had ran into when he got back, and I mean like aside from like Richard Fisk, the Rose. But with this following so closely to Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, Peter did run into the Hobgoblin a lot when he came back, and even before for that matter, but it didn't keep him from going to see Reed Richards. So it's like we're already seeing this parallel reality kind of veer in its own direction. But with Peter stopping to face the Hobgoblin here, it gets rough, but it ends pretty quickly, because when the Goblin tosses the bomb, knocking Peter into the wall, he's then like, I'm really gonna miss you like once I've killed Spider-Man. But then Peter's like, the difference between you and me is I don't miss. And then he webs around him and hits him with a parked car. And from there, Peter just stands over him like, I'm tired of this and I'm tired of you. And it throws the Hobgoblin off because he thinks that this guy had just crawled out of the wrong side of the web this morning. Like he doesn't know what's going on. And while this is happening, Peter hears the suit tell him to kill this guy. But instead of killing him, Peter unmasks him, which is how he finds out here that is Roderick Kingsley. And when Peter asks him why, Roderick told him it's because he wanted power. And the suit is just like, scare him. And it tells Peter, power through fear. And from there, Peter's like, I'll show you power, and he smacks him around a bit, but then he lets him know like, I'm not gonna web you up or send you to jail, because if he does, this guy will be right back out like every villain ever. And with doing this, he tells Roderick to spread the word to the other villains that Spider-Man is playing for keeps now. But right after this, when Peter heads off, he then runs into Black Cat. And when he does, like, he's not really in the mood. And when she sees him and she calls him Tiger, he's like, hey, whoa, don't call me Tiger. It's like main chick, side chick rule number 1. Don't do that. But really for Peter, and he doesn't say it here, but Tiger is a term of endearment that he associates with family, or those who are truly close to him. Like for MJ, she calls him Tiger, and once in a blue moon, he'll even call Aunt May Tiger. And they both mean very different things in their context, but even still is preserved for people closest to Peter. So for Felicia, he tells her just don't do that. But while he's here, he tells her that he put the hurt on Hobgoblin, and he put out the message, Spider-Man ain't no punk, and she agrees with the logic of scaring the villains so that they don't just keep coming back time after time. But after that, when he mentions that the suit was acting up, then she's like, didn't you say you're gonna get some genius guy to check it out? Who he had mentioned before, which was Reed Richards, and it's here where he tells Felicia, like, yeah, I'm gonna go to him and I'm gonna have him check it out. And when Peter goes to the Fantastic Four, like, Johnny announces his entrance in a playful way, like telling Reed, hey, Spidey's here to get his tracksuit checked out. But instead of saying something clever back, Spidey's just like, shut up, Torch. And it's very different from his normal behavior. And Johnny just kind of falls back like, all right, fine, I won't flame you no more. But when Peter gets here, Reed lets him know like it'll only take 30 minutes for him to check out the suit. And he asks Peter like, is there anything unusual that he's noticed about it lately? But when he tells Reed about the things that's been going on with him with getting less sleep and the web shooter malfunction, Peter lets Reed know that he doesn't think it's the suit because he doesn't sleep with the suit on, and when he wears the suit, he actually feels better. And when Peter lays down to get the scan, he asks Reed if he can just go ahead and get a little nap, because as we've seen, he really hasn't slept all night. And Reed tells him that it's cool because it's gonna take like just 30 minutes anyway, and Reed lets him know that he'll just wake him up when he's done. But when Peter goes to sleep, the nightmares creep in once again. And this time what he sees is a countless number of people who need saving, and Aunt May in his dream telling him that sometimes you need to hurt people in order to save people. But with Peter saying that he doesn't want to do that, like he doesn't want to hurt anyone, this dark voice then tells him that he needs to, and it changes into the voice of the symbiote telling him that he needs to be strong. Once again, trying to impose the equivalent of hurting people to showing strength. But right after this, Reed wakes him up because the tests tests are done. And when he wakes up, he's kind of like, oh yeah, did I tell you about the nightmares? But for Reed, like after seeing the test results, he let Spider-Man know that that would make sense because the suit, it's bonding to him physically and mentally, to where not only does the suit react to his thoughts, but also vice versa. And he lets him know like this suit isn't an advanced material, but it's something more like a symbiote. And it's here where we start to take an even steeper turn, because when Reed tells Spider-Man to take the suit off so they can keep it around for further investigation, Peter just gets up and he starts to leave, asking, is that really necessary? And he tells Reed like, no, I feel clear. This suit is alive and it has the right to make choices just like I do. And if the suit chooses to be with me, I'm gonna stay with it because we're helping each other. I can feel it. But as Spider-Man begins to leave, Reed reaches to stop him, but then he just turns around and crushes Reed's wrist, accusing Reed of being a greedy scientist and telling him that he refuses to let this living thing be locked in the prison and poked all day with a stick. And this is quite the departure from Amazing Spider-Man issue 258, to where Peter was ready to get it off, but all of a sudden he couldn't, and Reed had to reach for his sonic blaster. But then also with the suit off, Peter still needed to protect his identity, both from the Fantastic Four and the rest of the world, which is when Johnny then gave him one of the old Fantastic Four suits with a paper bag for a mask and a kick me sign on the back. But in this reality, with Peter telling Johnny to shut up, like a whole nother reality was created. But after Peter leaves the Fantastic Four, he then goes over to talk to his Aunt May, because they haven't talked since he's dropped out of school, so he wants to open that communication back up, but he also believes that talking to Aunt May would be a better remedy for his situation rather than having Reed or any scientist formulate a cure or solution. But when he goes to see Aunt May, he's unaware that he's being followed. But when he talks to Aunt May, he admits that he's not doing well, and he lets her know that he's aware that she's probably still mad, but lately it just feels like his head has been spinning. And he feels like she's the only person who can bring him back to a stillness. And right away she apologizes for shutting him out, but she lets him know like she just didn't like the thought of him not living up to his amazing potential. And when Peter hears this, like he gets ready to tell her that he's Spider-Man and just let everything out so she can understand, but then his spider sense goes off and Hobgoblin blows up the side of the house, and Peter's able to protect Aunt May like just in the nick of time, just before she's hit by the debris. But with the Hobgoblin following Peter here to a place he still considers to be home, Aunt May calls for Peter and Hobgoblin mocks her like, Peter, Spider Peter, save me. And Peter immediately just punches him back out into the street. And he tells the Goblin like, how dare you take this to my house? And he tells Peter like, you started this. When you unmasked me, when you threatened me, you changed everything. You ruined the game. But Peter cuts him off and he swing kicks him into a light pole. And from there he just starts beating the brakes off of Roderick. Like he doesn't even refer to him as Hobgoblin anymore. But then he tells Peter like, it hurts when it hits home, doesn't it? And when the Goblin says that, Peter then realizes that the whole time he's been out here putting the hurt on this guy, that he's left his Aunt May trapped in that burning building. So then immediately he turns around to get her, but the symbiote's like, no, don't go in the fire. It'll kill us. We can't do it. And while going back and forth with the symbiote, a second explosion comes from the house, knocking them both back and killing Aunt May. And when this happens, the symbiote is like, we're sorry. But then it flips and it tells Peter that he did this. And when Peter repeats after the symbiote saying he did this, referring to Hobgoblin, Peter then goes after the Goblin, but at this point, like his process of symbiosis, it has physically changed him again to an appearance that is way more terrifying. And the first thing he does from here is just web the Hobgoblin up, and Hobgoblin tries to plead to him like, you started this, and Peter just responds like, I'm going to finish it. And when he does this, he does like the slow, menacing walk towards him, and he thinks to himself again like, no matter what he does, people either get hurt or people die. And now with leaning into what the symbiote said about hurting people to show strength, he then grabs Hobgoblin's head and just crushes it, saying that now that he has the power, he's going to use it. And it's a crazy dark flip on Uncle Ben's old saying, with great power comes great responsibility, to where now the symbiote's got him more or less saying like, you know, with great power comes great hurt. Alright, so jumping back in, like just after Peter had killed the Hobgoblin, it's here where we see his symbiosis evolve both physically and mentally. And for the physical side, we see it as a more menacing look, but for the mental side, which started off looking like nightmares, but at this point they just turned into conversations between Peter and the symbiote. Because on both ends, the more harmonious they get, the less turbulence we see in the representation of the symbiosis. But it's here while he's having a conversation with the symbiote to where Peter brings up that the old saying from Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility, to where Peter thinks he's been seeing it wrong this whole time. And with talking to the symbiote, Peter believes that he has power and he believes that he has a responsibility to save people and to keep them safe, but with the way that he's been doing things before, he hasn't been keeping them safe. And with the whole cycle of sending supervillains to prison so they can go there for vacation and then just plan their next plot, but then when they get out, like those plans only lead to people getting killed, whether it's Gwen Stacy and her father, which we went into more depth about with Symbiote Spider-Man, but Peter sees this all as the same, whether it was Gwen, her father, Aunt May, or even his Uncle Ben when he let that robber get away. But like we had seen before, Peter believes that it's his responsibility to stop these villains before they're allowed to continue to kill more people. And it's here where the symbiote then brings it all back, telling Peter that it was his responsibility, but now it's our responsibility. And it's crazy because it's not just the process of symbiosis, but it's like this whole process of justification really. Because the symbiote is leading Peter to believe that things live, things die, like this is a part of nature. And the symbiote just adds on to the justification, telling Peter that these villains have essentially forfeit their right to life. Like it's nuts. Cold world, symbiote. But even with Peter feeling this way and leaning into this dark mindset, like he doesn't want Mary Jane to find out and he doesn't want people to think that he's a murderer. But then he walks past a newsstand and he's on the front page of the paper from the Daily Bugle that showed that he was spotted murdering Roger Kingsley. And you can tell right away that that's not going to sit well. But after this, we then jump over to Wilson Fisk, who's reading the paper, which reads that an eyewitness saw Spider-Man fighting the Hobgoblin, and with doing this, at one point Spider-Man just snapped. Like those were the words of the eyewitness. But with seeing this Wilson Fisk, he realizes that this is a problem, because his criminal organization, it can handle a 5% loss because of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. But with this new Spider-Man straight ending criminals, Fisk now realizes that Spider-Man is eventually going to come for him. And because of that, he tells James Wesley to make some calls, because from his perspective, this new Spider-Man's gotta go. But after this, we then go over to the Daily Bugle, where Jameson is pretty much shouting from the rooftops that he's been right this whole time. And at this point, he's just telling Robbie, who used to be one of the Daily Bugle's lead journalists, and I'm not sure if that's the case at this point, but Jameson is just telling him how he missed it, and Jameson trusts his own gut. And he had known this because he had a gut feeling about it. But as Jonah gets to type his next headline, which is Spider Manslaughter, but as soon as he sits down, he looks up and Spider-Man just jumps through the window. And when he gets there, Jonah's like, Robbie, call the police, we just had a murderer break in. And at this point, Spider-Man just like, do it. I don't care. And he pins Jonah to the wall and then crushes his left hand. And he lets Jonah know, like, this is exactly what you wanted, isn't it? And he tells him, like, even prior to now, all Spider-Man has done is clean up the city and help people. But when he's talking to Jonah and destroying that man's hand, Robbie tries to make his way to the door, but Spider-Man just webs the mess out of that guy. But then he yanks Jonah off of the wall by his broken hand, just insult to injury. And he lets Jonah know, like, we both got what we want, with Spider-Man being the criminal that Jonah always said that he was, but with doing it, he's figured out a way to help more people. But before he leaves, he tells Jonah, like, if he sees one more article about Spider-Man from the Daily Bugle, he's gonna come back and break the other hand. But after this, we then go back to the Fantastic Four, to where Ben and Reed, they're looking at the results that Reed ran on Spider-Man while Johnny's flying around trying to find him. But with looking at these results from the test, Reed says that it's only a matter of time before the symbiote permanently bonds with Spider-Man. And because of that, the Fantastic Four, they now have a clock counting down to where they need to find him. But at this point, Johnny has flown over every spot that he could think of, but there is no sign of Spider-Man anywhere. And it really has them nervous because the clock is ticking and Spider-Man is quickly reaching the point of no return. But after this, we then go over to Peter's apartment, to where MJ's let herself in once again. But she's come here to check on him because she hasn't seen him since Aunt May's funeral. He's not answering his phone, plus she's seen the headline of the Daily Bugle. But when she gets there and she makes her way to Peter's bedroom, and I gotta tell you, like, just the way that Pasquale Ferry just has this, it just looks brilliant. Because with Peter sleeping in midair with the symbiote just latched onto the walls, and the symbiote's also supporting his back, so there's that. But it also just has this horror element, like MJ had just walked in on Dracula sleeping. And when she wakes him up, he tells her, like, look, I know it looks weird, but you gotta believe me, like, it is extremely comfortable. But as we know, that's not the reason that she came here, because right away she asked Peter about what she'd seen in the paper, and she wants to know from him directly, like, is it true? And when she asks him, Peter, he doesn't say anything immediately, but then he goes on to explain to MJ that because of who he is and what he's capable of doing, he has to make a decision whether to let someone like the Hobgoblin live at the cost of an Aunt May. And he tells her it's not a decision that everybody can handle, and he lets her know because of his power, he's one of the people who have to make that decision. And from there, he just takes off, telling her that he's finally going to make that call. But also with him taking off, like, he can't stand the fact that MJ knows about all this. So once again, there's a bit of logic and a bit of conscience still eating away at him. But not long after he leaves, his spider sense goes off and he's attacked. And from here, man, it's go time. Because when his spider sense goes off and he barely dodges this blast, he then looks to see where it came from, and it's the Shocker. And man, I gotta tell you, like, as soon as I seen it, it was the Shocker. Like, every Shocker in every reality needs to avoid a symbiote Spider-Man at all costs. But with the Shocker coming after Peter, like, he knows that this guy, he just wouldn't do it alone. And his hero Scorpion then tries to blitz him, and then Peter's like, okay, this makes more sense. Scorpion's a little bit more dangerous. But essentially what these guys are doing here, they're calling his bluff. And they were definitely sent here by Wilson Fisk, but even still with that being the case and them seeing the headlines in the paper, they've been toe-to-toe with Spider-Man before, and with them just seeing him wearing black now, like, they're not buying it. But when Scorpion expresses this, like, you expect us to believe you gone bad? Like, you think and Peter just ends this guy. And from there, he just walks over to Shocker, who is shocked. And he's over there just lumped like a horror movie, like, this can't be life. But when this happens, it's quickly that Shocker realizes that Wilson Fisk was right, and that everything he had heard about Spider-Man turning into your friendly neighborhood murderer, like, it was the truth. But when he tries to go for like a surprise blast on Peter, Peter just dodges it very nonchalant, allowing it to hit the building behind him. And once again, to point out some of the non-Peter-like attributes of this, like, he doesn't even try to help the mother and their kid. And as it turns out, like, the mother and their child, they're okay. Like, the mom gets scuffed up a bit, but in any other scenario, Peter would have helped them out, either catching the debris of some webs or just pulling them out of the way. But that's just not the case here, because Peter, he pays it no mind, and he goes over to Shocker, to whom the last thing we heard him say was Fisk was right, which then takes us over to Wilson Fisk, who's lounging in his condo reading the biggest book I've ever seen, because he big already. Like, this guy went to Barnes and Noble's talking about, let me get that in the large. But it's not long after we see him here that Peter shows up, and Peter is dropping off limbs left and right. But with Peter finding Fisk here, like, Wilson Fisk was waiting for him, but he didn't expect him to be back like this quick. But when he gets there, Fisk tells him like he had did some research, because when he saw that Spider-Man had murdered the Hobgoblin, he had also noticed the woman that died in that fire was May Parker. So Fisk then figured, like, for her death to get such a reaction out of Spider-Man, they had to be close. So from there, the closest match to someone who lined up with Spider-Man's stature was Peter Parker. And after that, Fisk then looked to see if he had any other close family members so he could threaten, but he didn't find anyone, not a wife, not a girlfriend, no one. And so when Fisk starts to tell him how sad that is, Peter then sends his mouth through the back of his head, adding another body to the list. And I can't say that I wanted to see Wilson Fisk catch a brutality, but I will say that I've grown tired of seeing this big human being with no powers go toe-to-toe with Spider-Man. Like, stop it. That's cap. And even prior to this, like, an argument could be made that Peter has always been pulling his punches, and that's why Fisk has gotten the upper hand before. But I will counter that with the argument of, if you are an enhanced being who can catch a vehicle and sit it back down, then you would also be physically capable of one-punching any human. And miss me with all that physical peak human stuff, because you're still human. But after this, we then go over to the Sinister Six, and they've taken notice that Spider-Man has killed Hobgoblin, Scorpion, the Shocker, and now Wilson Fisk. And prior to now, like, Wilson Fisk, he did give these guys the invitation or solicitation to take down Spider-Man and get paid, but Kraven told these guys to hold back, because if they rushed in there like Shocker and Scorpion, then they would have got bodied too. And at this point, Mysterio is saying that they still need to lay low, but Kraven is like, no, we gotta band together and we gotta strike at once. But what I think is interesting here is that this is the beginning of the new Sinister Six, or at least that's what Otto calls them. And it's here where we get the big reveal of who the sixth member is, when Otto Octavius tells them that only one of us has seen this new Spider-Man up close, And then right after that, we get this reveal that the sixth member of this group, of the new Sinister Six in this story, and it's J. Jonah Jameson. And right off the bat, Jameson, he admits that he doesn't like working with these guys. And sure, he believes that each and every one of them should be locked up behind bars, but Spider-Man is way more dangerous than any of these guys. And for this Jameson, who has been right about Spider-Man, like, he's willing to do what he needs to do to stop this guy. But after this, Doc Ock, he gives Kraven the go to get things started as far as drafting up a plan, because the hunt is his expertise. So he tells Kraven to make a plan and get back to himself and the others, because at this point, with his own resources, Otto has no eyes on Spider-Man. But then his hero, one of his men, standing behind him by the screen, like, he suggests that they do something to lure Spider-Man out. But Otto just brushes this guy off. He tells him, like, I don't pay you to think, and he gives these guys the orders to go arm the other men, because after the new Sinister Six is done with Spider-Man, he wants to be ready to take care of the other villains, because he doesn't trust them. But then when the same guy doesn't go with the others to arm the men and get them ready, Otto doesn't even look at him, but he asks him, like, did I make myself clear? And then the dude just stabs Otto in the back, because this whole time it was Eddie Brock. And this was a twist that I did not expect. But when he does this, he lets Otto know that he's not gonna let him kill Spider-Man, because that's his job. Alright, so with us jumping back in, previously we had seen the reassembling of the Sinister Six, which in this case was called the new Sinister Six, with there being no Vulture in this case, but instead the addition of J. Jonah Jameson, who had allied himself with these villains after being assaulted by Spider-Man and just desperate to stop Spider-Man by any means necessary. But with moving forward, Otto Octavius, who's the traditional leader of the Sinister Six, he called for Kraven to craft a plan because that's Kraven's place of expertise. But then out of the blue, Otto Octavius is stealth attacked by Eddie Brock, who refuses to let anyone else kill Spider-Man aside from himself. But after seeing this then takes us over to the meetup between J. Jonah Jameson and the other members of the new Sinister Six, who at this point are prepared to execute Kraven's plan at this remote location. And when Jameson gets there, like, for one, they didn't think he was gonna follow through. But then on top of that, they also didn't think that Spider-Man was gonna try to kill all the villains. But also when Jameson gets here and he approaches Rhino, Electro, Mysterio, and Kraven, he's then met by the final new member of the Sinister Six, Brock Ock, who had not only discarded Otto Octavius, but he had taken his arms and attached them to himself. And with seeing this, like, I hope he cleaned that thing off, because I can't imagine that it still has like Otto Octavius' back sweat and hair still on it, but anyway. But like with Jameson seeing Eddie Brock, he immediately recognizes him, because he's like, hey, you're that reporter who got fired from the Globe. But then on top of that, he's shocked and surprised because this dude is wearing Doc Ock's arms. And when Jameson asks, like, where's Octavius, right away Eddie lets him know Octavius isn't showing up. And on top of that, Eddie tells him, like, he wasn't just fired, he was fired because Spider-Man destroyed his life. And with Eddie seeing it that way, with himself as the victim, he asks Jameson, like, what is a normal guy supposed to do against that monster Spider-Man? And Eddie tells Jameson, like, if anyone knows the answer to that question, like, you definitely do. To where in this case, he's definitely referring to Jameson's recent visit from the not so friendly neighborhood Spider-Man as like your exhibit A of a regular person versus what this guy's become. And when Eddie says this, Jameson, like, he doesn't argue the point, but he does ask everyone else there, like, if they're okay with this, and across the board, there's really no complaints. Kraven on one hand, he's kind of like, well, the more the merrier, which is really kind of weird because you lost the guy and gained one, so you're kind of at the same number. But also, Rhino mentions that he doesn't mind because Otto had always looked down on him, and for that reason, he really doesn't miss the bowl cut bandit. But after this, when Jameson looks around, and he's kind of like, okay, like, so this is where we're gonna do it. And when he says that, we also get this moment where Mysterio's like, it's okay, Jonah, you can say it, like, this is where we're killing Spider-Man. And with seeing Mysterio say that, I felt like it was a very chilling moment. Like, it was a nice addition to see Mysterio trying to get Jameson to lean into what they're about to do. But then also Mysterio goes on to tell Jameson that they're doing this out here because if they do it in the city, they absolutely run the risk of other heroes getting involved and things getting complicated. And that's why prior to this point, they planted a bug, so to speak, to lure Spider-Man out here and make it more of an isolated incident. And because of that, from this point forward, all they can really do is wait. But then after this, we go over to Reed Richards, who's still looking for Spider-Man by way of trying to find signatures of the symbiote throughout the city. And on top of that, like we've seen before, the Human Torch, he's flying around, also looking for Spider-Man, but neither of them had found anything. But while Reed is conducting his search, he's also on the horn with Captain America, who at this point acknowledges that Spider-Man's body count is up to 11, which on one hand, it also makes Reed regret like that he didn't do anything about this sooner, after analyzing the symbiote and seeing that it was a threat. But then on top of that, Reed Reed also fears that what Wilson Fisk had did, like after Spider-Man finds out, it's possible that he'll never stop this killing spree that he started. And with saying this, Reed sees the breaking news that the Beetle has been killed after a battle with Spider-Man. And with seeing this, it immediately lets us know about that bug, quote unquote, which Mysterio was talking about within Kraven's plans, because it was the Beetle's job to lure Spider-Man out into the ambush. But as it turned out, when Spider-Man faced off with the Beetle told him everything in fear for his own life. And because of that, Spider-Man is now making his way over to the new Sinister Six and making his way there, moving as low-key as possible, while also just going over these thoughts to himself, like what exactly he's doing, which starts off with him thinking about how he let these monsters run around for too long, which is why he pressed the Beetle to find out where the others were at. But with him thinking to himself about all of this, like he then starts to ask himself, like, what am I doing now? And he just drops his head. But then the symbiote jumps in and he's like, you're saving people. And from there, Peter lifts his head and he thinks to himself, I'm saving people. And from there, he just continues to make his way over to the new Sinister Six. But then jumping back over to the Sinister Six, like these guys are just waiting. And at one point you got Jameson, who tries to tell Eddie Brock, like, hey man, take a break, take a rest. And Eddie just not taking his eyes off the sky, like, no, I'm good. Like blinking is for the weak. But Jameson just stays outside with Eddie, or Brock Ock, because Jameson can't sleep. And I don't blame him, because the Spider-Man of this world or reality, like, he's the thing of nightmares. But then also, while Jameson's out here, he kind of calls Eddie on his crap, because when Eddie's saying that Spider-Man destroyed his life, Jameson lets him know, like, Eddie accused the wrong man of being Sin Eater. And after that, Eddie Brock was only fired after Spider-Man had caught the right guy. But within this conversation, before Jameson can finish, he hears something off in the bushes, so he goes to check it out. And when Jameson goes to see what it is, it's the Beetle webbed up in the trees. And as soon as he sees this, like Jameson, he screams, Eddie's like, he's here, and Mysterio. Mysterio's like, remember the plan? Like, Mysterio's the one keeping everyone calm. Like, remember your training. We can do this, people, come on. But then also when Mysterio's like, who has eyes on him? And Electro's like, there he is in the trees. And from right there, right away, they go into the next phase of Kraven's plan, which at this point hands it over to Mysterio for him to create an illusion. But in order for the others to not be confused by the illusion as well, Mysterio had made special goggles for the other villains so that they can still see reality and not be affected by his image inducers. But when Mysterio gets everything cranked up, Spider-Man is nowhere to be found. And when that happens, everyone's like, Kraven, where's he at? Like, you're the hunter, hunt him. And at first, Kraven, he doesn't see Spider-Man either, and he lets them know, like, Spider-Man either ran back into the woods, and then he's like, oh snap, Spider-Man's in the ground. And before these guys can even react, like, Spider-Man goes straight for Mysterio, destroying the illusion and seemingly disappearing from these guys. But then once again, with the quickness, before they get ready to draw him out, he just pops up right in front of them. But then after this, like, Rhino, he's first up. And when he goes for Spider-Man, he charges in hard. And we've seen how this is played out a number of times before with variable results. But this time, Spider-Man catches Rhino with the razor-sharp one-hitter quitter brutality. And when this happens, like, Spider-Man quickly tells him he's disappointed with this trap, because if you think about it, the version of Spider-Man who was trying not to kill these guys, he still beat all of them. And I mean, the case of Brock Ock is a little different, but in this case, at best, he's a less experienced Otto Octavius. But for Spider-Man, he calls out this ambush. He tells them his weak sauce, and he's showing them that even the more now that he's pretty much activated instant kill. But in the case of Eddie, who tries to tell Spider-Man, like, well, I'm different, you haven't faced me before. And Spider-Man just tells him, man, I don't know who the you are. And it don't really matter, because the dude you just missed me and hit, he a joke too. But even with all this going on, Kraven, he's still focused on the plan, because these different attacks from every direction, they're set to push Spider-Man into the barn, which at this point, Kraven is caught on fire. And then it's here where Jameson steps in, bringing back the old Spider Slayer Mark I, which originally the technology was created by Spencer Smythe in the 616, but then later at one point when I believe J. Jonah Jameson became mayor, he had then acquired that technology and made a suit, which made it possible for this ordinary man to keep up with the Amazing Spider-Man. And I kind of feel like Chip Zdarsky intentionally put in Eddie's comment to Jameson earlier for that reason, with Jameson making a similar comment in the main continuity about a regular person going up against Spider-Man. But towards the end of that, Jameson and his Spider Slayer squad, they eventually had a change of heart when Spider-Man helped them to stop the Chameleon. But in this case, jumping back into Spider's shadow, when Jameson steps in with his Spider Slayer armor and he plays his part within Kraven's plan, he grabs Spider-Man and he walks him into the fire, and Kraven throws a net over Spider-Man to keep him in, while Jameson Jameson holds him, with his suit being fire resistant. And with doing this, he's kind of telling Spider-Man like, I didn't want it to go this far. I tried to tell you to stop for years, but this is what it's come to. Like, at this point you left me no choice. But then because the symbiote is vulnerable to the fire, part of the symbiote uncovers from Peter's face, and Jameson sees that it's him. And when Jameson recognizes that it's Peter, when the barn explodes, Jameson protects Peter and he brings him out, because now with him knowing that Spider-Man was Peter Parker, Jameson has had a change of heart. But when he brings Peter out, Kraven tries to finish the job, but Jameson then knocks him out from behind, saving Peter's life and getting him out of there. Which, with this happening, it feels like a nice little flip or a wink towards your old school Jameson Spider Slayer. But with Jameson getting Peter out of there, and at this point it appears that the Spider Slayer armor is also destroyed, but with Jameson getting Peter out of there, Peter tells Jameson the whole situation with the symbiote, and he stops and asks Jonah like, are they all dead? And Jonah tells him like all of them are dead except for Kraven and Brock Ock. But then also Jameson, like, he's not mad at Peter, and he tells him like that suit, it made him a monster. But even with saying this, he still doesn't give him a pass on the previous 10 years, because even still, Jameson thinks that Spider-Man has always been a menace. But with them leaving here, Jameson tells Peter like, okay, let me get you home, and from there we'll like figure out what's next. And he's like, for now, like, we'll look on the bright side, like at least that thing died in the fire. But even with Jameson saying this, Peter lets him know that he can still feel the symbiote in his head, and because of that, he truly doesn't believe that this thing is gone. But after this, we then go back to Peter's apartment, and at Peter's apartment, we got Mary Jane Watson and Felicia Hardy. And when we jump to this part, you can tell Felicia is flexing her relationship with Peter to MJ just a little bit, because Felicia tells MJ like she already checked out the criminals and super criminals as far as looking for Spider, and no one really knows where he is. And then she tells MJ like, I imagine you checked in with his normal friends, which immediately sets MJ off, and she tells Felicia like, don't act like you know this other side of him so well. But then Felicia, she totally ends this argument, because she then tells MJ that there was a reason why he kept his identity a secret from MJ. And it's right then when Jameson brings Peter in. And it's like it's here where you can just insert Trey Songz YAS lyrics, and really just the hook of the song for the most part, because MJ's looking at Peter like he trash right now. But once again, this reminds me of that confrontation that we got within your original symbiote Spider-Man saga, where Mary Jane confronted Peter, telling him that she already knew that he was Spider-Man. And when we first got this in Amazing Spider-Man issue 258, I believe, but back at the time, it was a much crazier situation, because back then, Felicia came diving through the window saying, hey lover, without even looking to see who else was inside. But with this happening, it was the first time that Felicia and MJ had met. And when Felicia showed up, MJ stormed out. And Felicia almost did too, but the symbiote was choosing. And the symbiote chose Felicia. It was like, don't you let her go. Boy, you better web down that black cat. But it's pretty cool to revisit that like in a way within this story. But with Jameson bringing Peter back to his apartment and Peter starts to try to explain himself, MJ quickly tells him like, we don't have time for all that, we gotta get you out of here. And when Jameson asks him like, what's going on, like why? Felicia then adds on to that, and she lets Jameson and Peter know that Wilson Fisk had pulled one final move just before he was killed, and that final move was releasing the true identity of Spider-Man to the public. But then after this, we then jump over to the symbiote, who we had seen hitch a ride on the back of Jameson's van. And when we jump back to the symbiote, who is now at the Fantastic Four headquarters, and while being there, he's talking about Peter and how all of this wasn't Peter's fault, because the symbiote loved Peter, Peter loved the symbiote. But it all started to fall apart once the smart man got involved, and that's why the symbiote went to the Fantastic Four headquarters and it bonded with Reed Richards in order to use his knowledge and bring forth more symbiotes, which on the surface has a lot of Life Foundation vibes going on here. But also with this taking place, it really has me thinking of Carnage USA around the corner, or at least a version of that, or perhaps even both. But also what this does here is like it shows us the symbiote building on top of that reasoning that it had found with Peter, with them discussing how great power brings about great responsibility, and them redefining those ideals from Uncle Ben into this darker definition of it being their responsibility to choose who would live or die in order to save everyone. And it's because of that where now the symbiote is seeking greater power in order to save even more people. And it's nuts, because once again it makes me think of that the idea of the symbiote just going forward without the positive character development. And it really feels like we're gonna get a glimpse of that within these next couple of issues. Alright, so with this jumping right back in, like not long after Peter's fight with the Sinister Six, to where after that huge battle, Peter was separated from his symbiote in the fire, and with Jameson finding out and being fond of Peter Parker in this universe, like he actually likes the kid, he then takes Peter home, to where in that case Mary Jane and Felicia Hardy are there, which once again is another dangerous situation for Peter, having two exes with him in the same room. But it was also at this time that we find out, like before Wilson Fisk had died, he knew Spider-Man was going to come back and likely kill him, which he did, like he did exactly that. But once again, before Wilson Fisk had died, he found out Peter Parker was Spider-Man and he released that information to the world. So with Peter being brought back to his apartment now and them all just finding this out, police have now surrounded the whole building because Peter Parker is wanted for murder. And that's when Peter jumps up and puts on his regular suit. And let me say something here, because in the last issue, Peter was sitting in that chair looking like he was about to die. And I told you, like, he very much needed to do that. And I mean, of course, he was weakened from the fight with the Sinister Six, but then when you come from that to getting home with your two exes in the same room, you gotta use all those excuses so you don't gotta get to talking. And that's exactly what Peter did here, because as soon as he heard the cops was outside, he was like, okay, it's time to go. And like, suddenly he was able to speak clearly, get up, web sling, and everything. But then it was here where Peter made the call for him to go and take care of the situation, but first, everyone here needs to lay low. And to do so, he'll take Mary Jane home, and Felicia, she'll take Jameson home, which is a logical idea because Spider-Man and Black Cat are the only two here who can carry a body across the city, at least without walking through the front door. But with Peter saying this, it was very different than what everybody else had in their mind to do. Because for one, Felicia, she just wasn't feeling the whole idea of Peter leaving with Mary Jane. And Jameson, he was ready to put out a story to help Peter by putting out a cash reward for somebody who could catch the symbiote. But really the priority was just to get them out of there without being seen. Because for one, once you got so many stars, it ain't but a matter of time for the choppers come through. And when that happens, your chances have then dropped to slim to none. Because the helicopters, they got thermal imaging. And from there, they're just following your heat signature. Unless you just roll under a parked truck. But that's something a girl in high school told me. I never looked at it the same. And I definitely never tried it. So don't think that this is a how-to video. But while Peter's taking Mary Jane home, he then sees the Baxter building nearly covered with a symbiote, which immediately lets Peter know that his symbiote has gotten Reed Richards, and from there the symbiote is doing something super extra right now. And with seeing this, initially MJ tries to make Peter feel better by telling him it wasn't exactly his fault, but Peter knows that much of this is his responsibility because for one, he brought the symbiote here, but then on top of that, it kind of leans into the idea of if this symbiote is actually evil, or if that was something that the symbiote had inherited from Peter. And really with this idea, there's a number of ways that this could go, and mainly because since like 2018 up till now 2021, like there's been a lot of history added on to the symbiote, which could make an argument for why the symbiote could have started off evil, like with Venom First Host for example, to where we then found out that prior to Peter getting the symbiote, it was harvested from one of Null's experimental planets and then weaponized in the Kree Skrull War. But in this case with this story, which is a reimagining of Peter bringing back the symbiote from the first Secret Wars, like in this case we're given the idea that the symbiote was practically a blank slate, and the evil thoughts and feelings that the symbiote had expressed to Peter, that those were originally his thoughts and his feelings, because he always thought it would be easier to kill these villains who keep getting locked up and just keep coming back, which I'm sure plenty heroes think about. But then it's here also where MJ tells Peter like he's always had this dark side to him, which almost seems like in this case that Peter has perhaps an even darker side to him than your main 616 Peter Parker, which is what possibly tipped the scales here, but that's not necessarily the direction that it goes in. But MJ tells Peter that he's always had this really dark side to him, but as long as she's known him, he's fought against it and he's won. But with telling him this, she lets him know like don't feel bad because you got this suit that was like a drug that then twisted and manipulated what was already there, because without the suit, he's still the Peter Parker that his aunt and uncle had raised, and that's who's standing here right now. And with telling him this, MJ's like, go get him, Tiger. And it's here where we then go in closer, like just in front of the Baxter building, so we have the Avengers and Iron Man and like his Mark, was that Mark 8? Like the old school red and silver, but then also along with them, you got X-Factor. And with seeing them, man, first I gotta say, this is one of my favorite suits that Cyclops ever had. And like, I don't have like a whole lot of physical copies of comic books because buying digital is just so much easier to keep up with, but I still got X-Factor issue 66 sitting on my shelf right now. And I also remember I used to have this Cyclops action figure that had this like little button in the back to where you press it and his eyes light up. Man, I miss that thing. And I have no clue what happened to it. Man, it's like you get older and some of your favorite toys just get raptured away. But while they're all here outside and they're kind of putting their plan together, and at this point they figure it's a hostage situation, but they can't really get any communications inside. And this is where Peter and MJ show up, and Peter's like, I know what it wants, and immediately Johnny goes off on him because Peter could have avoided this had he just taken off the symbiote when he stopped by before and just left it in containment with Reed. But Sue cuts all of that off because what they need to do is focus on how to get into this building. So when she then asks Spider-Man like what he knows as far as what he can share that can help them out, and it's here where he tells everyone that he knows that it's vulnerable to fire, and Johnny can be a huge help with that. But aside from that, everyone else here, they also know what Johnny's filled them in on, which is practically secondhand info from Reed. And because this symbiote substance has been covering the whole building and shielding it against anything that Tony Stark could throw at it, they've more or less put together the idea that the symbiote has taken over Reed Richards and has used his intelligence to strengthen this symbiote substance that's covering the whole building. But at this point, it's really just their guess because nobody's been inside. But when Peter lets him know that he can feel the suit trying to tell him to come in, and Captain America tells him like, well, we know that thing controlled you, so I don't think it would be a good idea for you to just walk in there and just let that happen again. And when he says this, Peter takes off his mask and he looks Captain America in the eye and he tells him that he'll never let that thing take a hold of him again. And when saying that, Cap looks at him like, that's Cap. But then shortly after, Steve, he then agrees with the idea of letting Peter in because at this time there's really not a whole lot of options. But he also tells Peter that when he goes in, he needs to quickly either find a way to get those people out or quickly find a way to let the other heroes in, because if not, then they're gonna have to more or less just assume that he's just been taken too. But with going in, MJ tries to stop Peter and tell him that he really shouldn't do this alone. But Peter insists that he does because it's his responsibility. But as soon as he goes in, both MJ and Johnny zoom in right behind him, which for Johnny, I don't know why bringing him in was not a part of plan A. But then again, that's not really a guaranteed win because we saw what happened to King Black. But they don't know that because it was never their future in this world. But with Peter seeing the two of them rush in, initially he's mad, but then Johnny's like, okay, just get over it. And when he asks Peter if he has a plan, and more or less Peter's like, of course, just get up there and see what's going on. But while they're going back and forth, MJ, she also sees like the other people who are in the Baxter building and how they're still alive, but they've been bonded into like this trance incoherent state. And at this time, Johnny creates a passageway through the elevator shaft for him and Peter to head up to the 33rd floor, while MJ, on the other hand, like she's in the get the strap mode. But before Peter goes up with Johnny, he tells MJ to stay down here because he really doesn't know exactly what the symbiote has up there waiting on him. But as Peter and Johnny are heading up to Reed's lab, through the elevator shaft, they're then suddenly attacked by Ben Grimm. But when he jumps down the elevator shaft, Johnny just gets out of the way by just punching through to an earlier floor. But Peter then takes the full brunt, which knocks him all the way down to the bottom. And it's crazy because even when he tries to crawl out, like Ben still grabs him. And he just gets to clobbering Peter. But then it's here where Peter kind of thinks of what MJ said as far as him having that darkness in him, and Peter then comes up with the idea to more or less use that into his favor, because for this Peter, when he's angry, he thinks less, and when he lets go, like the moves just come automatic. And he's able to do that here and without holding back, because when it's all said and done, this is still Ben Grimm. And Spider-Man is not just gonna punch him to death. But on the other hand, as far as Ben punches Spider-Man, like with a good enough punch, like I don't know, he might. And when Ben catches Peter with a good one, it almost looks like it for a second. But then when Peter bounces back, he's able to knock Ben out of the building, which he does intentionally in order to use the heroes outside, who he knows are ready to help. But also during the time that Peter was going back and forth with Ben, at this point Johnny has already made his way up to Reed's lab, and he's now face to face with the symbiote that has taken over Reed. And with this happening, it's not like the symbiote and Reed have come together, but instead the symbiote has just been using Reed's brain for knowledge in order to use Reed to save everyone, like the symbiote believes that Peter wants him to do. And with doing this, he's got this suit to protect him like from fire, but also like we've seen before, this symbiote has already created its own offspring, but on top of that, he made sure that they're not vulnerable to fire. But also with the symbiote telling this to Johnny, he pushes a couple buttons on his board, and with doing this, there's like this huge blast that everyone sees coming from the Baxter building, which is also kind of like this obvious sign that like everything's not going great up top, but then also for us, kind of foreshadowing like, okay, get ready for something crazy. Because on the inside, as Peter is still getting up from his battle between him and Ben, he hears Johnny over the comms just trying to get back to him like, like, dude, where you at? Like, help me, Peter. Because right now, Johnny's still alone going up against your symbiote, Reed Richards, who in this case came out looking very different than what we'd seen with the Maker when he got his symbiote, or any of the cases where he's got a symbiote for that matter. But also here, we also got this unique case to where the symbiote is taken over, and it's the symbiote using Reed and speaking through him. rather than most of the time to where you see someone in a symbiote just being like an evil version of themselves. But it's also here where the symbiote grabs Johnny and tells him it would be a shame to kill him, because the symbiote could also feel how much Reed doesn't want it to kill Johnny. But before that goes any further, the symbiote is then shot in the back by MJ. And while this is happening, Peter hears it all going over the comms, but before he can even tend to that, he also has the issue of all the other heroes who have now been taken over by the offspring of his symbiote as a result of it just pushing the button and letting all the babies out. Because now it's just symbiotes coming down from everywhere and just snatching heroes up. And for Peter, after seeing this, he doesn't know what he's gonna do. Alright, so we're getting into part 5 of Spider's Shadow, after Peter had faced off with Ben Grimm to where he knocked him outside so that everyone else out there could help. But as it turned out, this plan, it just didn't pan out too well, because it then caused everyone else who was outside to then be taken under the influence of Peter's symbiote. And it's kind of a weird thing that I want to talk about for just a second here, because in the case of that modified symbiote that was on Ben, spreading out and taking over all the heroes that were out there, with the way that this is done, it isn't like your conventional symbiote offspring, because even with the lab symbiote that we saw that was created and placed on the Ben Grimm, it was more like a gas-like form, and even when we saw it take a hold of Ben, it wasn't like your conventional symbiote situation. But I say this because I want you to keep in mind that these different variants that Peter's symbiote has created, that they're pretty much brought to you by the intelligence of Reed Richards, which practically means that these things are modified with whatever technology or discoveries that Reed Richards has come across. And this is practically what allows your single variant to jump from one host and spread out to a dozen. But with that said, just keep in mind that these aren't one-to-one symbiotes, but instead each instance, whether it be what we saw in Ben Grimm or the huge one that covered the whole Baxter building, they're all just modified extensions of Peter's symbiote. And we'll talk about more of the details of how that works in just a little bit. But with the symbiote taking control of the heroes and bringing them in after Peter, his spider sense is going crazy, and when he sees them come in, he reaches out to Johnny to get MJ out of the building. But then when we jump over to Johnny, it's here where Peter's symbiote recognizes MJ from the different images in Peter's mind that we'd seen before when it was trying to bond with Peter, that it remembers her from Peter's mind, and she was the reason why Peter could never fully complete the symbiosis, because his love for her was holding him back. But it's when MJ hears this, all she really hears is Peter loves me, and she really just gets caught up off those words, man, right now, here. But the symbiote tells her it only sees her as an obstacle that's in the way of Peter being a quote better version of himself. But when this happens, Johnny swoops in because he's man, this sounds like the part where MJ dies, so let me get her out of here. Because also, she ain't doing nothing but standing there she just waiting to get killed too. But it's here when this happens where Johnny does like Peter said, and he gets MJ out of there. And with doing so, your symbiote Reed Richards is right after them. But also when Johnny and MJ leave, Peter notices that his spider sense calms down, so he hits Johnny what's happening, and it's here where he finds out that not only has a symbiote left with Reed Richards, but also all the other heroes that are being controlled, they're following his symbiote too, leaving Peter by himself in the Baxter building. To where from there, Johnny pretty much tells them that he's bought Peter some time and that Peter needs to use that time and make his way up to Reed's lab so that he can look around and hopefully find a way to finish this. And in the meantime, while Peter's looking in the lab, Johnny will just do everything he can to keep MJ safe. But then while Peter's here, next we jump over to Sue Richards, who had actually called for Alicia Masters or Alicia Grimm, and I'm not really sure if her and Ben are married yet at this point, but Sue had called Alicia over for her to pick up Franklin and get him out of there, since there was this emergency at the Baxter building. But also with Alicia arriving here when she did, it was pretty much perfect timing, because this also created the scenario to where Sue had to take Franklin and leave the other heroes, which is also why she wasn't taken control of like everyone else. But as soon as she hands off Franklin, it's here where she looks up and she sees Johnny carrying Mary Jane while being chased by symbiote Reed and the other heroes. But then also it's here where we see the symbiote speaking through the heroes by way of Captain America, who with a group of others just coming from the side, catching Johnny off guard. But with this happening, they're coordinating under the control of Peter's symbiote while it's using Reed's body, which also shows us that this is like a version of a hive mind control thing going on. But with Johnny getting hit with Cap's shield, he drops MJ, but fortunately Sue catches her, just in time because MJ was nearly donezo. But even with her catching MJ, Sue and Johnny are struggling to hold these guys off. They're just ridiculously outnumbered. But back over at the Baxter building, you then had the case of Peter, who's pulled up Reed's research along with the history of what his symbiote had put together in order to modify these different parts of itself. And as it turns out, what Peter finds is that the symbiote had only taken elements of itself and mixed them with Reed's unstable molecule formula. And so like as far as the unstable molecule formula, or really just unstable molecules, this is something that goes back all the way to Fantastic Four Volume 1, because unstable molecules were just the idea or the concept behind the suits of the Fantastic Four, which were also affected by their cosmic incident. So when Reed stretched, his suit would also stretch and not tear, and when Johnny set flame on, his suit wouldn't just burn up. Sue's clothes can turn invisible along with her, and for Ben Grimm, like his underwear just wouldn't tear, I guess. But then after this sometime, and I'm not sure exactly when, but the unstable molecules formula, it was essentially just repeating this process with other materials, which in most cases would be other superheroes' uniforms. But with unstable molecules essentially performing in a way to where they react to a base material or subject, in this case is pieces of the symbiote, which from there are being controlled in like a hive mind. But with seeing this, Peter figures out that if he stops his symbiote, then all the others will stop reacting and everyone else will be set free. But with Peter still trying to figure out like how to pull this off, he then finds a device in the lab that belongs to Ben, and all of a sudden, boom, that's it. He figures it out, and he immediately tells Johnny to lose Reed and buy them some time, which he does, causing him to leave with MJ, but with doing so leaving Sue Richards on her own. And when this happens, like your symbiote Reed and the others, they try to follow Johnny, but Sue, she's not having that. But just when she gives Johnny a head start, Thor then comes in and he smashes Sue's psionic force field with Mjolnir. And when this happens, she's then taken off guard and scooped up by the symbiote, who then takes her back to the Baxter building in order to use her as a bargaining chip in order to get Peter to just give up and turn himself over. Because at this point, with the symbiote no longer knowing where MJ is, threatening Sue is like option number 2. But when they get back to the Baxter building, it sees Peter climb up to the roof, and it tells Peter not to try anything because it's stronger now, and at this point Peter wouldn't be able to resist if he wanted to. But then it's here where he tells the symbiote that that's not what you want, because really the symbiote would rather for the two of them to bond willingly, and it's because of that where Peter makes an offer to where the symbiote lets MJ live and it lets the other heroes go, then he'll willingly turn himself over and allow the symbiote to bond with him again. And the symbiote agrees, but it's here where he tells Peter that this one is too smart, and because of that the symbiote can't let him live. And right away the symbiote just kills Reed Richards. And with this happening right in front of his face, the pain of watching is like almost unbearable. But after killing Reed and throwing his body off the roof like it was nothing, Peter then jumps back down into the lab, and the symbiote chases right behind him. And the symbiote tells him that it knows that there's nothing in this lab that could hurt it because it made sure of that before it left. But when the symbiote chased him and caught up, like as soon as it touched Peter, it then quickly realized that this is not Peter at all, but instead this was Johnny, who was wearing Ben Grimm's image inducer, which is a device that Reed had made for Ben after the incident, with him feeling guilty about not being able to reverse Ben's condition. So at one point Reed had made the image inducer so that Ben could walk around and look human. But in this case, with Johnny showing up on the roof looking like Peter, he lured the symbiote right into the oven and cranked that thing up, cooking the whole lab, but in the process also freeing all the other heroes, to whom some of which may have had a long fall. It's kind of hard to say. But even with this happening and it being wrapped up, you still have a number of things that need to be sorted through. Because with all the deaths that we've seen throughout this story, like things just can't go back to normal. And with that being the case, we do get a bit of extra context to kind of show us where things land. To where first we then go into Eddie Brock, who's still recovering from that last bout with Spider-Man and Eddie's temporary moment with posing as Brock Ock. But it's here where Jameson goes to see Eddie, and Jameson, of all people, tells Eddie that he needs to let go of his hatred for Spider-Man. Now, I know we in an alternate reality, but with Jameson saying this, he admits that he had to do this himself. And really what it stemmed from was making Spider-Man out to be like this figure, or this boogeyman as he would say, as if Spider-Man were the cause of all his problems. But really Jameson had also come to this realization when he realized that underneath it all, Spider-Man was just a man. But with saying this, Jameson also realizes that this is exactly what Eddie's going through. And it's here where he offers his support to Eddie, because he knows this process of letting go is not really just going to happen overnight. But then he also lets Eddie know that he's been in contact with his lawyer and he's going to testify on Eddie's behalf to help him out. And regardless of what turns up with Eddie killing Otto Octavius, Jameson still lets Eddie know that he's not alone. But in the case of Peter, who everybody knows is Spider-Man, he's still got a body count that's stacked pretty high. But because a number of the other heroes were also taken over by the overall influence of his symbiote, their testimonies helped Peter in a huge way, to where ultimately it was a quick trial and he was found not guilty on all charges. But even with Peter being acquitted, it was like bittersweet, because sure, he gets to keep his freedom, but he still feels horrible about everything that happened. And MJ helps him out by telling him that all he can really do is just do his best and push towards happiness when he can. And with hearing MJ say this, like, it helps, but then Peter's also thinking like, man, there ain't no way I can go back out there as Spider-Man. And with him thinking this, I can't help but to think myself, like, he's right. Because if there's one thing that's stickier than Peter literally climbing up a wall, it's the name Spider-Manslaughter. Like, that name is going nowhere. So he can go ahead and just forget about that. But then while they're here, it isn't too much long after to where they're then approached by Sue Richards. And when she gets there, she asks MJ to give her and Peter a minute. And when she does, she tells Peter that her, Ben, and Johnny, that they know that Reed's death wasn't Peter's fault. But also that up until now, she hadn't been responding to Peter's messages, mainly because the three of them had just been putting the pieces back together. But then she also tells Peter that she knows that he's no stranger to tragedy, much like her and the team when they went through the incident that gave them their powers. And it's here where she tells Peter that Reed had almost died from the guilt from Ben being turned into the Thing, but instead of giving into that tragedy and that guilt, Reed turned all of it around when he made them heroes. And it was through this where Reed showed her that you have to look on the other side of tragedy and find meaning. And with her telling this to Peter, she offers for her family to take their tragedy and Peter to take his guilt, and for them all to find a way to get through it together, which from here in this universe, this then sets up the start of Peter joining the Fantastic Four. But then aside from this, we then have like this post-credit scene, right? Which in this case is really more so an epilogue, but just with the way that it starts, it feels like a post-credit scene. Because when it starts off, we see Wilson Fisk pretty much standing in the same spot that we had first seen him within this series, looking out on the city, but then it's here where he's approached by his scientists or his doctors who said they got news back from the lab. But when they approach him, he doesn't even want to hear it because he is disgusted that Peter Parker has never truly paid for his crimes. And on top of that, Peter Parker is still out there and operating like a free man and doing that in a city that belongs to the Kingpin. But with them saying this, James Wesley, who's Kingpin's attorney, and also like his white-collar right-hand man in the sense of organized crime, but Wesley tells Fisk that they need to focus on his health. But at this point, Fisk isn't worried about that. He says all that matters is destroying Peter Parker, and that's all that he cares about, even if he falls apart waiting for it to happen. But then it's here where Wesley tells him that the doctors are proposing that he doesn't have to choose between getting better or destroying Peter Parker, because of with what they found, he can have both. And it's like we're just left with that, like that cliffhanger at the conclusion, but also with what appears to be one of the symbiote creations which were recovered after the destruction of Reed's lab. And it's a crazy cliffhanger, man. Like, this needs to be a series because there's so much more that could happen from here. But also, if it leads to Kingpin getting the symbiote, like we've seen that happen before, and I did a video on it like a while back, but whether if that's what it comes to again, or if we see Eddie take the symbiote and more or less leave Wilson Fisk to die because Eddie just can't let go, like either way, I'm here for it, man. Because also, if Peter's symbiote did survive somehow, it would be a whole nother beast with it containing Reed Richards' memory. But we'll see if anything pans out. Fingers crossed. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below or over on Discord, and we'll do it again on the next one. All right, later.